Globalization and free trade are controversial subjects. If you live in a wealthy country, the conversation has a lot to do with the exploitation of cheap labor and the trade-off between getting cheaper products and losing jobs at home. However, if you live in a poor country, the conversation is very different. For people in those low-wage countries, globalization can often mean creating badly needed jobs, increasing incomes, and having the chance to become more like the wealthier countries of the world. Now, it's easy to take a hardline stance on one side or the other, but if you've been watching my videos, you may have realized by now that honest conversations about economics are never that simple. This video is going to be the start of a series on international economics, covering international trade and its potential impact, both positive and negative, on nations and the people who live in them. This is my favorite area of economics and my actual academic focus, so I'm quite excited about it. Today we're going to try to start building a basic understanding of why trade is, broadly speaking, a good thing, and maybe get some sneak peeks at some of the complicating factors that can make it hard to figure out exactly how to do it properly. Keep in mind, this video is only meant to be an intro to the concept, so if you think I'm talking about something too simplistically, that's probably because I am. But don't worry, if you stick around, hopefully I'll be able to dive deeper into some of those more specific aspects in later videos. So what are we waiting for? Let's get started. Now let's start our story about the benefits of trade by looking at a quote from Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations. If a foreign country can supply us with a commodity cheaper than we ourselves can make it, better buy it off them with some part of the produce of our own industry employed in a way in which we have some advantage. The general industry of the country will not thereby be diminished, but only left to find out the way in which it can be employed with the greatest advantage. What Smith is saying here is essentially this. If you are really good at making clothing and I am really good at making cheese, then the way for us both to have as much cheese and clothing as possible is for us to each focus on making the thing that we're good at and then sharing our surpluses with each other. It's simply a matter of looking at our resources together and using them in the way that they are most effective. Super simple, right? Sharing makes everything better. This concept is formalized in the early 19th century by a guy named David Ricardo with his theory of comparative advantage. Don't worry, you don't have to remember the names. Ricardo simply showed mathematically that Smith was right through comparing relative costs, basically the differences between how much cheese you or I would need to stop making in order to be able to make a single extra unit of clothing. But this theory only looked at one thing: labor productivity. It simply assumed that for whatever reason, your labor is more efficient at making clothing and my labor is more efficient at making cheese. Maybe this is because of differences in our skill and knowledge about clothing and cheese making. Maybe it is because of differences in the technologies that we have available to us. And maybe it's just because of differences in our physical geographic location. The theory isn't specific about that stuff. And that's one of the reasons why it isn't very practically useful. But it demonstrates an interesting and valuable point. Global well-being is improved when everyone produces what they're best at and shares their surpluses with each other. Okay, fast forward to the 1930s and we get the Heckscher-Ohlin model, the next major contribution to the way that we think about trade. Again, don't worry, you don't have to remember the names. This model of trade is a bit different, but still very simple. It assumes that every country possesses some level of each of the three theoretical factors of production: land, labor, and capital, and that these levels for each input can differ and vary between countries. But remember, the important thing is the relative amounts, how much labor you have relative to how much capital or land you have, not absolute amounts. Okay, so each thing that we can choose to produce requires some combination of these inputs. Some products might require a lot more capital, while other products require a larger amount of labor. Now, if your country has a lot of extra labor relative to how much land and capital you have, then that means that it will be cheaper for you to use labor than it would be for you to use capital. And this means that you will be able to produce labor-intensive products more cheaply relative to other countries than you could produce capital-intensive products. As a result, the model suggests that the most efficient thing for you to do is to produce stuff that requires a lot of labor, export as much of it as you can, and then import things that require a lot of capital from those countries which may be capital abundant. Now, one of the oversimplifications of this model is the fact that it straight up assumes that every country has exactly the same technology and exactly the same ability to employ that technology, meaning that the combination of inputs required to produce something like, say, a bushel of corn is exactly the same in every country. Also, it assumes that the relative abundance of labor and capital is fixed and doesn't change over time. Now, both of these assumptions are, of course, nonsense in the real world. These models are not meant to provide a perfect representation of the real world, but just like Ricardo's theory, the Heckscher-Ohlin model still demonstrates an interesting and useful fact about trade dynamics. The relative cost of production inputs in your country has an impact on what you can efficiently produce and how you participate in international trade. Throughout the last century, there's been a whole lot of economics work building on top of these two theories in order to better understand why and how countries trade with each other. For instance, in the 1950s, it seemed like the US was contradicting the Heckscher-Ohlin model, because at the time, the US was the most capital-abundant country in the world by far, but it still was exporting mostly labor-intensive products. Now, this theoretical gap was mostly filled by the realization that there is a technical difference between what we call skilled labor and unskilled labor. You can't easily substitute one for the other, and the US, it turns out, was exporting products that required a lot of skilled labor specifically, which it had at the time in abundance relative to other countries. This later led to the development of human capital theory and the idea that increasing the skill of your labor force is an important part of making your country more productive and better off. Also in the 1950s, we had the introduction of the gravity model, which tried to explain why countries tend to trade more with other countries that are simply closer. So, for example, sometimes countries will choose to import, say, cars from the country next door instead of getting them from a country that might be halfway across the world where they might be produced better and cheaper. This might happen because of close political and business relations with the nearby countries, and maybe it has something to do with the transportation costs. It's hard to say exactly why, and it might differ from case to case, but it's an observable fact that this influence of distance exists. One topic of discussion is how to better understand the idea of capital. Traditionally, it's roughly equivalent to something like machines used in production, but that's not a very complete or helpful definition. Really, capital is a much more abstract concept, encompassing a range of things, from physical capital, financial capital, transferable knowledge, business relationships, infrastructure, intellectual property, ecological stocks and characteristics, etc. Then, of course, there are plenty of other factors that can affect how efficient a country is at producing things, from the quality of financial market and institutions in a country to all kinds of government regulations. But still, the fact remains that some countries just produce some things cheaper and better than other countries do. So the conclusion of Smith, Ricardo, and Heckscher and Ohlin that trading makes everyone better off still holds as a broad truth of simple algebra. And so, particularly from the 1970s on, the international community, led by the wealthiest and most developed countries of the world, tried its hardest to convince everyone that making trade as free as possible would be the best thing for the whole world. This would simply be because any distortions or barriers to trade, like tariffs and trade quotas, government subsidies, and so on, mess with the international price of things that your citizens are either producing for export or trying to import. Ultimately, this affects decisions about what to buy from where, which means that your citizens might decide not to buy the most efficiently and cheaply produced car because you are taxing imports, and instead they might buy a car produced in your country, which may have been a waste of your productive resources that could have been spent doing something else more efficiently. Or alternatively, citizens in my country might choose to buy a car from your country just because your government gave the manufacturer a huge subsidy so that they could sell it way cheaper than it actually costs. Either way, the world has been made collectively less productive and worse off. Don't worry, I know that probably sounded kind of silly to some of you, but I'm willing to bet that you would have a hard time explaining exactly why that is. Keep listening, we'll explore it together. Here's the thing. There are two huge monsters lurking just below the surface, threatening to blow the lid off of everything. The first is the realization that major transitions are expensive and take time. Economies are huge, monstrously complex machines. Much like the Titanic, they cannot turn on a dime, and it takes great care to avoid hitting those icebergs. In my previous video about finance, I talked about how investments are highly mobile and can shift from one activity to another pretty easily. But labor and physical capital don't work that way. It's really hard to productively use a tractor in a factory that produces microchips. Similarly, it might be relatively easy to have farmers who were growing corn switch over to growing soybeans, but when you have a bunch of people working in a car factory and that production and those factories move to another country, it can be really hard to put all that labor back to work doing something else. They have to be trained, they have to go someplace where the jobs exist, and those extra resources that were freed up in the economy need to be effectively redeployed so that those new jobs will exist at all. And all of that might not even be realistically possible within the lifespan of the current generation. The second giant monster is the simple fact that we live in a dynamic world. Everything is always changing. Not only are we constantly developing new technologies and building on our existing knowledge, but some countries are further ahead in developing their capabilities than others. Imagine a country which today simply could not produce good quality cars cheaply, but given the technology and the money necessary to build and operate the factories, as well as the time necessary to develop an industrial culture and knowledge around car making, that country could become the most efficient and cheap car producer that the world has ever seen. If we all stick to just making what we're good at making right now, that country will never be given the chance to make cars, which means that the world, in the long run, won't gain the benefit of having the best possible car maker making cars. In a real historical analogy, the UK in the last half of the 20th century was one of the world's biggest proponents of free trade and ensuring that all countries follow their comparative advantage. But if they had followed their own advice 200 years earlier, they would never have led the Industrial Revolution, and they would probably still today be pretty much only producing and exporting wool cloth. See, hindering free trade, though perhaps inefficient in the short run, can sometimes allow countries the chance to develop new, productive, and internationally competitive industries that they would otherwise not be able to build. How that works, though, is an entire conversation on its own, which I hope I get to have with you in the future. Okay, so trade is good. Globalization, which is basically just global international cooperation, is good. It makes everyone richer and better off because it allows us to specialize and get the most out of the resources that we have as a global community. However, if we treat the world as if it were actually as simple as some theoretical models, we risk doing incredible harm and losing incredible opportunities. There are mathematically undeniable reasons to pursue freer trade, but in doing so, we can't simply ignore the human realities by letting unfortunate people who just happened to lose their jobs suffer during those transition periods. If the goal of trade is to make everyone richer and better off, then we need to find ways to ensure that gains are distributed and transitions are accelerated so that everyone is actually richer and better off. At the same time, we have to acknowledge that sometimes we may need to make exceptions and let other countries have what may seem like an unfair advantage in order to not only allow for gigantic improvements in the lives of people in another country that we may never meet, but also to improve our own long-term prosperity as members of the global community. Truly, we are all just one big global community, and trade is nothing more than sharing. So, like I said at the beginning, this video is just the start of a series on this subject. In the coming weeks, I want to make videos looking at special considerations about trade from the perspective of wealthy industrialized countries, as well as from the perspective of countries that are trying to become industrialized. I want to look at how trade imbalances affect national economies and maybe even dip into my particular area of expertise, which deals with industrial policy, innovation, and what countries can do to develop further. But the next video, I think, will probably be about something quite specific. Why do low-wage countries have low wages? For now, thanks for watching, and I hope to see you next time.